Well, the saints are quieting, so that I'm going to take that as a signal to begin. Although we are 3 minutes early, which means that we're 7 minutes late because this study starts at 9:30. But I was instructed my first week here not to start before 9:40. So now that I've been here 5 weeks, I'm going to take a risk and start at 9:37. Good morning and welcome. I'm glad you all are here this morning. Some of you might be here for the first time, and if that's the case, we're glad that you've joined us today and picking up midstream on this 10-week-long exploration of what we're calling Echoes of Scripture and the Letters of Paul. What we're essentially doing is thinking about Paul as interpreter. How does he articulate a theology, a sense of mission, a sense of Christian identity in the early church by drawing on the very old texts, the texts of ancient Israel, what we now today call the Old Testament. And if you were here for previous weeks, I'm glad that you have not yet dropped the course. As I've said before, the ad drop period has passed. So if you are here today, you are stuck with it to the end, or we'll get a withdrawal on your transcript if you drop. I said in previous weeks that there would not be a midterm, and I sort of lied. Today we're going to have a pop midterm. It's a very quick, it's actually video-based. It's not a Scantron, it's not essay-based. There's a video-based midterm. And that's coming up in just a moment. But before we get there, as is our practice, we want to start with a brief review. In the first 2 weeks of this study, we thought about the idea of Paul as interpreter. And we took, in the second week, a look at what Paul's Bible was like and all the ways in which his, what we would call Old Testament, was both like and not like what we have today as an Old Testament. And then in the third and fourth weeks, we went on to two very difficult topics. Now, this is a teaching strategy. You front load courses with difficult material to try to get the kind of the hangers-on to drop out. And you all have stayed. So despite my best efforts to drive you away with the most difficult topics. But the two topics were Paul's view of the Gentiles and Paul's view of Israel. Now, if this felt difficult to you, as it did to me, I think it's in part because this was a difficult issue for Paul, both personally and pastorally. For Paul was in a bit of a bind in the first century. On the one hand, Paul was an apostle to the Gentiles, as Romans 11:13 tells us. He was called to preach Christ to non-Jews, and as a result of this, he was met with considerable resistance. Now, not only among Jewish folks, but also among Christians with a Jewish background. So all were skeptical in a way of this mission he had to preach Christ, to preach the news of Jesus' life, death, teaching, and resurrection to this foreign people, to a people not typically considered part of the people of God. So that was on the one hand. On the other hand, Paul was a member of the people of Israel. As Philippians tells us, he was a Hebrew born of Hebrews. And that didn't cease to be true even after his Damascus Road experience where he, quote-unquote, converts to Christianity, although we'll look at that topic later today. The Gentiles inferred that since they were now included in the community of Christ, that perhaps the Jews no longer belonged in that community. Perhaps there was just a radical shift. The people of God used to be Israel, and now the people of God are the Gentiles, the early church, these new followers of Christ. And it put Paul in quite a bind. Both communities disliked him, to say the least. He was basically on the outs among both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. Instead of, and to kind of make his point, the way he navigated this difficult situation was to turn to the pages of the Old Testament. And this is what is very strange. At one and the same time, he turns to the Old Testament and finds stories and ideas and themes that justifies in his mind why the Gentiles should be included in the early church. But at the same time, he turns to the same pages, indeed, sometimes even the same exact story, for justification about why Israel still matters. So he turns to one text to try to answer both sides, both opponents. Now, instead of recapping all of the different interpretive moves he does, let me just draw a conclusion to the last 2 weeks. So even if you weren't here for the last 2 weeks, this is the real payoff anyway. So maybe you think you were justified in not being here because you could get all you needed in this one statement. If you were here, this hopefully will bring it together. Here's my point. and I think it's the one most instructive for the church today. What would have been, no doubt, far easier for Paul to do is to sever the identity of early Christians either from the Gentiles or from Israel. It would have been very easy and much more convenient and would have led to much less controversy if Paul simply said, no, the community of Christ is for the people of Israel. Or no, the community of Christ are for the Gentiles. But thanks be to God, or let me just actually say one more thing about that. In doing so, Paul would have created two branches of the early Christian church. There would have been a Christian Gentile church, the first church of Christian Gentiles, and there would have been central church of the Christian Jews in the same city at the same time. A church split in this view would have attempted to solve a theological difference. And it also, I think, let me add, would have created two canons, or at least would have created a priority of one canon over the other. For the Jewish Christians, the priority of the Old Testament over the forming New Testament. For Gentile believers, there would have been a priority of the New Testament over the Old Testament. But thanks be to God, Paul chose a much more difficult task, but I think a better one for the church. First, Paul realized, I think, at its core, that church splits don't solve theological problems. They simply heighten them by making two different sides more visible and solidified. Second, he fundamentally does not believe that differences in theological perspective, even those as big as ones that potentially separated Jews and Christians, or Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, he didn't even think that those sorts of theological perspectives warranted dividing up the early church. In other words, he realized that the unity of the body does not require uniformity of thinking. The unity of the body does not require uniformity of thinking. And so he thought, in a way, that to be of multiple minds and opinions, one could be of multiple minds and opinions, but remain one body. And I think this thing that Paul did, at its core, whether you agree with, follow, or think he's crazy for the sorts of arguments he makes about the Old Testament, what he's trying to do at a pastoral level, at a church level, in keeping the early church together, I think that, maybe more than anything, is the model for the church today. So, with that, we'll wrap up our review there. I just want to, just as a little side note, as a tangent, here are just two radically different, or two pictures of Paul. Let me try to say this. My words aren't working this morning. Two pictures of Paul from radically different artists and time periods. But what do you notice about both portrayals of Paul? Do they look alike? Yes. They do look alike. Centuries apart, completely different cultures, completely different artists. Why do these look alike? If we put up 12 more pictures of Paul, they all would look roughly like this. Why is that? Did we discover a Polaroid in ancient Corinth of Paul? Was there a nice, finely crafted bust of Paul at Ephesus? Do we find a physical description of Paul in Acts or any of his letters? The answer to all of them, of course, is no. But what we do have, curiously enough, is a 2nd century CE text called the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Now, this is not a canonical text. You won't find this in your New Testament or your Old. It is more legendary than it is historical. It tells of certain journeys and travels and exploits of Thecla, a very kind of early feminist, actually, in a way, in the early church, and Paul. It was originally written in Syriac, or at least we have evidence of it in Syriac. So it was not canonical, but it was widely read by the church and by others in the ancient world. And what's very curious about the Acts of Paul and Thecla is that it includes a description of Paul's appearance that all of these artists are drawing on. Now listen to the description. You tell me if you think this sounds like an attractive man. Here's what it says. Paul was a man of middling size, that is about 5'7", my height or lower, and his hair was scanty, i.e. bald, and his legs were a little crooked, and his knees were projecting, that is, he was bow-legged, and he had large eyes, and his, this is my favorite part, his eyebrows met. in the middle. That is, he had a unibrow, and his nose was somewhat long, and now here's the odd part, and he was full of grace and mercy. At one time, he seemed like a man, and at another time, he seemed like an angel. Now, I'm not sure what comes to mind when you think of an angel, but I do not think of a unibrow, bald, short, bow-legged, with a hooked nose. That's not my picture of most angels, but maybe your picture of angels is different than mine. So what's going on with this description? Does Paul sound like an attractive man? Why describe him this way? Well, okay, so the most obvious answer is these people knew what Paul looked like, and they were just describing him. That's very possible, very possible. Does anyone know any other guesses, though? Because remember, this was written in the 2nd century CE, so at least 100 years after Paul. So maybe the author here, who we don't know who it is, might never have met Paul, might never have seen Paul. Some scholars have puzzled about this, and they said maybe this is kind of a stereotypical caricature of an ancient Jewish person. That is, well, they weren't describing Paul, they never had seen Paul, but they were just describing a Jewish person, right? That's right, yeah, that's right. So maybe there's some truth to that too. But here's the very curious thing, and I think that I like this explanation the best. In a very ancient Greco-Roman literature, we find very similar descriptions of other people who are not Jewish, okay? They are, on the whole, military leaders. This is a standard trope about what the perfect military person or the perfect leader looked like. That is, they weren't really describing their appearance. They're saying, like, a military leader tends to look like this. And in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, they use the same description to describe Paul, perhaps as a way, in our mind, this kind of makes him look a little silly or a little gamely or unsightly, but perhaps in the ancient world, this sort of description would have signaled, in a way, Paul's leadership in the early church. We don't know for sure, but it's a compelling and tantalizing possibility that this was a way to kind of portray Paul as leader rather than to portray Paul as a little bit of an unsightly person. Anyway, there's Paul. Well, he's not, and that's because he was struggling with the Gentiles and the Jews. This is why he writes the letters. You read Romans 9 and 11, you realize he looks like this. Like, that's the reason.
Also, yeah. Jesus might not have been blonde, blue eyes.
Yeah, it's probably likely that he was not blonde or blue eyes. In another study, I'll tell you about where we got that picture of Jesus by an artist named Warner Salmon in the 1950s. But that's for another study at another time. Let's move on to today's topic. I usually try to make my intros long enough so I have no time to say anything new in the next week. So all you're really getting is the first week repeated every week. I've never really done a new study. But let's move on to week 5's topic, which I've juggled the topics around just a little bit, and I'll tell you why in a moment. It's called Paul's Hermeneutics. Paul's Hermeneutics. Thus far, I think some of us, maybe all of us, at least me, feels a bit confused about what Paul's doing with the Old Testament. Or maybe you feel a bit unconvinced by the sorts of arguments he makes about the Old Testament. Or maybe, perhaps, even a bit annoyed about how he's doing what he's doing in his letters. At least I have felt a little bit of that each week as I have prepared. How, you might ask, did Paul arrive at such a reading of the Old Testament? Was he following a certain method? Was he working out certain unresolved personal issues, maybe in his family or in his community? Were there certain life experiences that were instrumental? Or perhaps it was his culture or his education or his background that influenced how he read the Old Testament. In raising these questions about why did Paul read the way he read, we are essentially asking a question about Paul's hermeneutics. Now you ask, hermeneu? What is this thing called hermeneutics? What are we actually talking about today? Let me turn it to the class and see if anyone would be bold enough to suggest a possible definition of hermeneutics. Yes?
It's the art of interpretation.
Ooh. I love it. The art of interpretation. Not just interpretation, but it's the art of interpretation. Very nicely said. That, in fact, is my first little bullet point here. I did see you looking at my computer before class. You skipped ahead. No, that is excellent. Thank you. The art of interpretation. Let me see if anyone else wants to fill that out more. How would you describe hermeneutics? Any other ideas? What goes into hermeneutics? Mary Ellen.
Hermes, the guy who brings the flowers, is the messenger.
Ah.
It's convey how a message is conveyed.
How a message is conveyed, or maybe even received in this context. Yes, thank you. Very, very good. Any others on this? Good. I think the art of understanding of text, it puts it so concisely and so nicely. It's essentially how all of our life experiences, cultural background, history, family, identity, how all of that stuff in our life influences how we understand a text. So we might talk about it in terms of underlying perspectives and guiding interests that bring us to or help us arrive at a certain interpretation of a text, or perhaps image. It doesn't have to be a text, but for our purposes of a text and of particularly the biblical text. Now, in Christian theology, we often talk about hermeneutics with respect to a particular group. So we talk about feminist hermeneutics, African American hermeneutics, ecological hermeneutics, we talk about missional hermeneutics, and in all of these ways, all of these things, we are talking about groups who read the Bible from a particular perspective, with particular interests and experiences in mind, be they the interests and experiences of women, the African American community, the interests of the environment, or the interests of the mission of the church. All of these different perspectives we might label as a certain hermeneutic. Now, as you look at this list, you might say, well, I'm not any of those things. I'm neither woman nor African American, though some of you, of course, are. I'm not particularly interested in the environment, at least not today, and I don't even know what missional hermeneutics means. So you might think, well, this all applies to other people. The fact is, and the reason why we're doing this study with Paul, is that we all read from a certain perspective, of course. We all have life experiences and identity and cultures and histories and families and education and backgrounds that shape how we read Scripture. We all have a hermeneutical lens or hermeneutical perspective. And to show you how this works, here's your pop midterm. Here's your pop midterm. So we're actually going to watch a video. Now, oops, I think the video is at its end. We need to bring it back. How do I do that? Okay, now here's the thing. If you've seen this before, if you have an advanced copy, you were looking at the slides again. If you've seen this before, you have to promise to say nothing or you'll ruin the test for everyone else. So if you know the answer, hang in there. Here's the thing. We're going to watch a video. How do we make this big? I tried this out and it worked the first time. Let's see if it works. Here's what's going to happen. In this video, you're going to see 6 people, 2 basketballs. There's going to be 3 people with white shirts and 3 people in black shirts. They're going to be passing the ball back and forth. The white team passes the ball to other members of the white team. The black team passes the ball to other members of the black team. This is a test in your observational skills. Here it is. It's very difficult, actually, because there's all of this moving around. You need to see how many times the white team, the team with the white shirts, passes the ball. So every time they pass the ball, you have to keep track. Now, do this to yourself. You have to look very closely because it gets very confusing. And hopefully here, this picture will get bigger. Oops, no, wait, stop. Let me try this. Well, can you all see that? It was bigger when, this will add to the challenge of it. It was bigger when I tried this out at home. Okay. See, there's your 2 teams. So remember, you're counting how many times the white team passes the ball. They're not moving. 0. Oh, no, come on. Do we not have wireless in this room? Is that... Okay, pause, talk amongst yourselves for 1 second. I'm going to try to sort this out. No, I know, I unplugged it. Okay. All right, let's try this again. Okay, I think we're in business now.
The monkey business illusion.
Okay,
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball.
so you got your instructions? You know what you're looking for? We need complete silence as we do this to aid concentration. Okay, hang on now. Almost done. Okay, how many? Let me see the count. 16? Anyone see any different than 16? 15? Any 17s? 17? Any 18s? 13s? 14s? There seems to be a consensus around 16. Now, in fact, those of you who had 16,
The correct answer is 16 passes.
let me ask you another question. Raise of hands. Have to be honest. How many people saw the gorilla? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How many are in this room? 40? 50? So about 25% of you saw the gorilla. In the middle of this video, a big, hairy gorilla, I'm not joking, I'll show you the video again, walks onto the screen, pounds his chest, and then walks off. Okay? We'll show the video again. We'll show the video. Now, okay, so for you 10 folks, let me see those hands again of the folks who saw the gorilla. You're probably feeling very proud about your observational skills at this point. How many, what color, or did you notice the color of the screen changing? The color of the curtain, I should say, behind them changes about 5 times. Okay? Did any of you who saw the gorilla notice one person on the black team leave?
Yes.
Okay, so you got 2, Paul, out of 3. I don't think anyone saw all 3 of the major things that happened. There's a reason for all this in a second.
Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla.
Now, we obviously are trending lower than that average in this group. I'll attribute that to Sunday morning.
Probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game?
Here's your second chance at the video. So the curtain is red.
There goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold.
This is not doctored. This is the same video that you saw. So what's going on?
For gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
What's going on with this?
And that's the monkey business illusion.
Why do I bring this up?
Learn more about this
Okay.
the original gorilla experiment at theinvisible.gorilla.com.
Hang on. Okay. So,
How many that got the 16? I mean, how many that saw the gorilla got the 16 right?
that's actually a great question.
They may not have been paying attention.
That's exactly right. What is this video about? Why is this video about hermeneutics? What we come to a text or a video or an image expecting to see, what are kind of our underlying perspectives and guiding questions, right? You were told under no certain uncertain terms, count the number of times the white team passes the ball. That was your hermeneutic. That was your question, your experience, your background that you brought to the text. Now, when you brought that to the text, most of you got it right, even though it was quite difficult. But you missed, because you were seeing a text, or a video in this case, from that perspective, you missed other things that were incredibly obvious. So if I had told you all, watch for the gorilla, raise your hand when you see the gorilla, no one would have missed it. No one in the room. If I would have said, raise your hand when the color of the curtain changes, everyone would have raised their hand at one moment. But because you were focused on something else, you missed things that were incredibly obvious. This is how it works when we read texts. And this is how it works when we read the Bible. We actually see different things in the text, not because the text is different, Not because the text changes, but because we bring different questions, perspectives, background to a text that focuses how we see things. That's hermeneutics. That's what we all do. And our hermeneutics are different, and we can flesh that out at another time. But we all have this hermeneutic. So what I want to do today, although it would be very interesting to think about our own hermeneutical lenses, that's a whole other study that I hope to do. But today we're actually going to think, what is Paul looking at? You know, what hairy gorillas does Paul miss? And what are the driving questions that makes Paul do the things he does with the Old Testament? So that's what we mean by Paul's hermeneutics. That's where we're heading. And the way I want to do this is by asking, we want to try to uncover Paul's hermeneutic by looking more closely at the interests, experiences, and background that might factor into how he reads the Old Testament. And we'll do so by posing 4 different questions that I think are relevant to his particular hermeneutic. Paul?
How would we find that on YouTube?
Oh, good question. Type in YouTube the gorilla experiment. There's a wonderful book in which this research is published. There's tons of other things like this that you can, you're given certain, they're all different, but they all talk about kind of the way vision and memory is constructed and how the mind works. It's fascinating stuff. I think the book is called The Gorilla Experiment, although I can't quite remember what it is. But if you type in gorilla experiment in YouTube, you'll get to this one. And there actually, I should just say, there's 2 varieties. There's one in which there's just the gorilla goes through, right? But they realized that once people knew about that video, people knew to look for the gorilla. So they added these other elements, the person leaving the team in the curtain changing, so that the experiment could kind of work on you twice, even if you knew the gorilla was there. Let me just pause actually at this point for any other questions before we move on to 4 questions about Paul's hermeneutic. I think we did okay on our midterm, I think, by the way. Margaret?
2 things. One is, that's why you want more than 1 witness if possible.
Yes.
The Old Testament required 2.
Yeah, that's right, that's right.
And the other is, at some point, maybe as a PS, you could tell us the difference in hermeneutics and exegesis.
Ah,
And I don't mean eggs of Jesus.
yeah. Or one time, there's another term, eisegesis. Exegesis means read out of the text. Eisegesis means to read in. But one time I was preparing a lesson over at Columbia, and I was trying to get down some notes, and I was using that little talk-to-text function on my iPhone. And I was walking, and I said eisegesis, and I looked down, and Siri wrote, I see Jesus. And so eisegesis does not mean I see Jesus. It's to read in. Margaret, just a brief answer to that. I would say that exegesis, when we talk about exegesis or interpretation, we often, at least in seminaries and in churches, we often mean methods. That is, what rules do I follow in order to interpret this text? Am I reading from a literary perspective? Am I reading from a theological perspective? Am I reading from a historical perspective? It's methods. It's stuff that you can read in a handbook and learn, this is how scholars do X, Y, or Z. That is, methods are part of hermeneutics, but hermeneutics involves more than just method. It involves kind of life experience, background, these other parts of our identity and cultural location that may not affect our method, but add to or fill out the sort of interpretations that we have. Or at least that's kind of the one way to draw that distinction. But that's a great question. Any others at this point? About gorillas or any other such things? Yes?
If you look at the brain program on television, you can see that same thing with the gorilla.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Interesting.
The brain game.
The brain games. Okay. Well, I'll have to look that up. I'm not familiar with it, but that's great. They're really fascinating experiments. Because because they always work on you. Even if you think you know, so I knew this video, and I looked at some other videos that the same sociologists made, and thinking I know what they're up to. It got me every time. Okay, so Paul's hermeneutic. So question 1, 4 questions to uncover the background of Paul's hermeneutic. Question 1, is Paul's hermeneutic, that is his way of thinking about text, a result of his Jewish background. That is there something about his training, his education, that fundamentally has shaped the way he reads the Old Testament? And to a certain extent, the answer is yes. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Paul's biographical background, but Acts 22:3 suggests that Paul received training from someone named Gamaliel, a prominent Pharisee of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, so that we know he studied Paul in his early years in the traditional way in which a scribe or a Pharisee would have studied back in those days. Paul says in Acts, or through Luke, Paul says, "I am a Jew born of Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city," meaning Jerusalem, "at the feet of Gamaliel, educated strictly according to our ancestral law," that is the Old Testament or Torah, "being zealous for God just as all of you are today." Now, perhaps because of Paul's thought, because of this training, Paul's thought in many ways reflected standard views of Palestinian Jews during the 1st century CE. That is, there's a way in which Paul's education shapes him very much like all of his colleagues, many other Jews at the same time in the same place. We know this for a couple reasons. One, his approach to Scripture, his approach to Torah, including the oral traditions that surround it, were very much in line with Pharisaical Judaism of his day. Now, we think of Pharisaical Judaism in a negative light, in part because of the presentation the Gospels give of Pharisees in contrast to Jesus. This is just a group of Jews. We need not think of it negatively. Paul was a strict Jewish person, and his views of Torah or Scripture were very common during his day, perhaps because of his education. We also know that other parts of Paul's thought are very stereotypically Jewish. His view of history, his view of apocalypticism, all these other things, Paul is square in... Can you say square in line? Doesn't make any sense. Paul is in line with, or his views square with, standard views of Judaism of his day. I'm a couple clicks behind, sorry. But on the other hand, so all this would lead us to think that his hermeneutic is strongly informed by his Jewish training. But on the other hand, his way of reading the Old Testament is not exclusively or only shaped by his Jewish background. First, as we've seen already in previous weeks, certain readings of the Old Testament would have clearly went against the grain of most Jewish interpretations of his day. Think about his reading of the story of Abraham and Sarah as reason for the inclusion of the Gentiles. That's exact opposite to what any Jewish person of the day would have said. They would have read the story of Abraham and Sarah and said, aha, this shows the priority of Jews in God's kingdom. And Paul says, aha, this shows the priority of Gentiles in God's kingdom. So he would have been reading against the grain in many ways. So if he is a Jewish interpreter, he at times is a highly unorthodox Jewish interpreter. Second, he is from Tarsus in Cilicia. This is off the southwest coast of Turkey. Sorry, I'm clicks behind again. And it was the center of Greek philosophy and culture. So in many ways, despite being a good Pharisee, Paul was perhaps more influenced by Greek philosophy and Greek culture than he was Jewish culture and Jewish thought. This doesn't mean that he was an expert in Plato, but he was aware of Stoic philosophy and Plato's ideas, and it had some influence. This is evident in the fact that Paul follows standard practices of Greco-Roman rhetoric. That is, how Paul presents his arguments in his letters is very typical of how Greek writers would have presented ideas or teachings during his day. I'm going to skip a particular example for the sake of time, but suffice it to say that if you were in the 1st century CE and found one of Paul's letters and you knew nothing about his background, you didn't know he was Jewish, you didn't know anything about him, you would have assumed you were reading Greek literature. You would not have thought, oh, this is Jewish, or this is Pharisaical. You would have thought, on the whole, that you were reading Greek literature. So if his Jewish background had some influence on his reading of text, his Greek background had as much, if not more, influence on how he read those texts. Well, I thought there was one other thing to say. Okay, so while he was, let me pull it together this way. While Paul was certainly trained as a Jew, his interpretive outlook is informed by multiple cultural and philosophical inputs. We cannot reduce him to his Jewish training, nor to his Greek culture. And this is kind of what makes Paul so difficult to understand as a person. He is this blend, this amalgamation of Jewish and Greek, and it comes out in his letters. It's almost as if sometimes we can find places in his letter where we think, Paul is reasoning as a good Greek student of Plato. And other times we can look in his letters and say, Paul is reasoning as a good Jewish student of Gamaliel. He does both and puts both sometimes in the same letter, sometimes in verses right back to back with one another. It just makes Paul an incredibly complex and interesting individual to interpret. But so at the very least in this first point, we have to recognize that Paul's hermeneutical background is multicultural. And multi-educational. I'm not sure that's a term. But he has multiple inputs of his education that shaped how he read. Let me pause at this point for any questions about Paul's Jewish background from Paul.
So we also know that, I'm just trying to figure out what it was, either his mother or his father were Roman citizens.
Yeah, indeed.
Ergo, he could claim.
That's right. So that was a position of prestige for him.
Right, so now we got the influence of the dinner table.
Yes.
Would that have been Greek?
That would be more on the right-hand column, the kind of the Greco-Roman cultural influence.
So what would the difference be between the worldview of a Roman citizen versus a traditional Greek philosophy?
That's a good question. I tend to combine those two things into Greco-Roman. I'm sure a scholar of antiquity would parse that more finely than I do. But within the Roman Empire, there was a strong and dominant influence of Greek culture and Greek philosophy. So again, not to completely gloss both of those things, but they usually go hand in hand together. Yeah.
Maybe like a northerner who grew up in the South.
Yeah, no, I think something similar, or even you kind of take today. What would be an example? Like we have certain ideas of, I don't know, either philosophy or history, even if we never studied philosophy or history, Greek philosophy or the history of the Roman Empire. We have certain names and ideas kind of rattling around in the background by virtue of growing up in our society. I think something would have been similarly true of Paul in his kind of Greco-Roman background. Was there another? Yeah.
You may have answered this in prior weeks. Did Paul do a lot of writing himself, or was he have somebody scribing? And in what language would he?
Good. Yeah, great question. Paul would have done a lot of writing, we think, but also Paul would have more commonly dictated his letters. In one letter in the New Testament, Paul makes reference to writing it in his own hand. I believe it's 2 Thessalonians, but don't quote me on that. Does anyone know? I think it's 2 Thessalonians. He ends with that. And that might mean that he added his signature at the end. So someone else wrote it and he added his signature. In either case, correspondence like this would have been widely written in Greek, in part because it was the most common or universal language of the day. It was the lingua franca for the most part. And Paul was writing to places that would have been fluent in Greek. So it was the easiest form of communication, or the form of communication that had the most widest audience. Yes. Again, my words are a little lagging behind this morning for my ideas.
The Jewish Gentiles would have been reading.
Yes. So even a Jewish person would have known Greek. In fact, that would have been more of a common language for administration, government, teaching. Jews of this time would have known a little bit of Hebrew, but primarily only when it came to reading the Hebrew Bible. Hebrew was not an active language during that time, or a spoken language, I should say. Great questions. Okay, let me move on to our second question about Paul's hermeneutic. And this is an important one because I think it's a very misunderstood one. Is Paul's hermeneutic essentially or inherently anti-Jewish? Is Paul's hermeneutic essentially or inherently anti-Jewish? This has been an oft-repeated idea, especially by those, both past and present, who have not been so keen on Paul. Throughout the ages, Christians have produced to be fair, many anti-Jewish ideas. And not a few of these ideas have been rooted in teachings of Paul. It's also the case that Paul has traditionally and stereotypically been pitted as a foil against Jesus, with Jesus tending to offer a more palatable, more opening, more welcoming view, and Paul offering a more restrictive or adversarial view of the kingdom. These ideas are not coming out of thin air. And so we might say that in tone, Paul is, at times, here's the technical term, kind of anti-Jewish. Here's what I mean by that. Paul, in Romans 10, holds the Jewish community culpable for not believing in Christ. So his words about them would have been controversial, or at least would have been received by them as perhaps a little adversarial. His rhetoric is quite acerbic at times. Galatians 5:12 is an interesting and poignant example. In speaking of those pressuring the Gentiles to be circumcised, those who said, look, you can be Gentile, but you have to be circumcised in order to be members of Christ, Paul essentially says, and this is my paraphrase in my unpublished translation of the Bible, he essentially says, I wish, speaking of those folks, I wish the knife would slip and that they would castrate themselves. This is pointed language, right? And would have been very inflammatory to any Jew or any Christian Jew at this time. There's also in Paul's writing a hint of supersessionism. Now, supersessionism is that idea that the Christian church has replaced Israel completely and fully as the people of God, and that the New Testament renders null and void all that came before it. Now, I put 2 question marks, not for rhetorical flourish, at the end of this, because there's 2 questions we need to raise about whether Paul was, in fact, supersessionist. One is this. It's not entirely clear that the most supersessionist leading book, the book of Hebrews, is from Paul. It doesn't say it was written by Paul. Paul doesn't claim to write it. The early church, on the whole, didn't think Paul wrote it, but eventually a tradition emerged that associated Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, with Paul. That's question mark number 1. Question mark number 2 is this. It's not entirely clear that even if Paul did write it, that Hebrews is supersessionist. It has been read that way in certain Christian circles, but if we were doing a long study of Hebrews, we would see that actually this would be a slightly overgeneralized view of the book as a whole. Nevertheless, in tone only, Paul seems to be a bit anti-Jewish. And in fact, we know from Acts 9:23 that the Jews plotted to kill him. So he did at least enough to be somewhat of an endangered species during his time. If Paul was on Facebook, which I think he wasn't, but if Paul was on Facebook, his relationship status with the Jews would have been, it's complicated. He is Jewish, but there's some things going on creating tension in that relationship. Now, here, let me add the caveat here. In substance, he's not anti-Jewish. In tone, I think he kind of is. And in substance, he, I think, decidedly is not anti-Jewish. And if there's one thing you took away from this whole series, and I hope you take away 2, but if you only took away one thing from the whole 10 weeks, it would be this, that Paul's theology, his use of the Old Testament, is not inherently or essentially to articulate an anti-Jewish position. A couple reasons. He, at the core, refuses to abandon the sacred scriptures of his people, of Israel. And not just in terms of the number of his quotations of the Old Testament, but at every turn, as we've always said in this study, Paul is borrowing ideas, images, themes, and concepts that are fundamentally Jewish at their core. He could have turned away from all those things, and he does not. That would be an odd thing to do if one were anti-Jewish. Second, he speaks openly about the advantages of being a Jew. He thinks that there still is, primarily because the Jewish people have been entrusted with the oracles of God. He says there is advantage. He raises this question in Romans. Is there an advantage then to be a Jew if we all are members of the body of Christ through faith? And he doesn't say no. He says, indeed, there is an advantage to be from the people of Israel. So he argues specifically for this. And in fact, he also, he's tenacious in his argument for the inclusion of Israel, saying that Israel is the holy root of God's people. Here's one text that I think is often overlooked by those who argue that Paul is anti-Jewish. It's quite lengthy, but I think it's instructive for our purposes. This is from Romans 11, 16 to 24, with a few things left out. He says, this is an extended allegory. He says, if the root is holy, then the branches are also holy. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, he's speaking to Gentiles, remember, in this letter, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in their place, that is, in Israel's place, to share the rich root of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. He's warning the Gentiles not to get too high and mighty about their place in the kingdom of Christ, because they were grafted on. They weren't the true root. If you do boast, remember that it is not you that support the root, but the root, i.e. Israel, that supports you. You will say, branches were broken off, that is, parts of Israel were broken off, so that I might be grafted in. That's true, he says. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand only through faith. So do not become proud, but stand in awe. And even those of Israel, if they do not persist in unbelief, will be grafted back in. So Israel's not only the root of the tree, but there's potential for Israel to also be grafted in, just like the Gentiles. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you have been cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches, that is, again, Israel, be grafted back into their own tree? This is a message that would have warned the Gentiles of becoming too proud or too boastful about their place in the kingdom. This would have reminded his Gentile readers of the original and essential place of Israel among God's people. This is not the sort of thing one says if one is anti-Jewish. Paul, at his core, is not anti-Jewish. And so because of this, I think all of this puts pressure then on what we think happened to Paul on that road to Damascus. We mentioned this, I think, last week or maybe it was the week before, that we typically talk about Acts 9, Paul's road to Damascus experience when he's blinded by the light from Jesus, which, by the way, is described in 3 distinct ways in the book of Acts. So we're not entirely sure what does, in fact, happen on that road to Damascus. But nevertheless, it's typical in Christian circles to talk about this as Paul's conversion. Typical to talk about it as Paul's conversion. But if Paul is not essentially anti-Jewish, in what sense was he converted? It all depends on what we mean by conversion. And this, to me, is, I think, the most important point of this week's study. If we mean by conversion a conversion from one religion, that is Judaism, to another religion, that is Christianity, then Paul certainly was not converted on the road to Damascus. Why do I say that? Because Christianity essentially did not exist when Paul walked to Damascus. There was no other religion for Paul to be converted into. At this point, anyone who believed in and followed Christ were Jewish. You were a follower of Christ if you were Jewish, or Jewish people could be followers of Christ. You didn't have to convert religion. Paul did not convert religion on the road to Damascus. So if we mean by conversion a religious conversion, by switching religions, then Paul essentially was not converted on the road to Damascus. Now, perhaps we mean by conversion a moral conversion. That is, Paul acted this and that way. He was a hooligan beforehand, a drunkard, all these other things. And then the road to Damascus happens, and his life takes a complete 180, a complete U-turn. He gives up this, that, and the other thing, and he becomes this pious person. We have no evidence, actually, that Paul's morals changed. Paul boasted, in fact, before he was on the road to Damascus, of his strict adherence to the law. He boasted that he was, in fact, one of the strictest of Jews. And that continued to be true of him after. So Paul also was not converted morally. Here's what I think, here's the sort of conversion I think Paul had then. He had a vocational conversion. Not a religious one, not a moral one, but a vocational conversion. And by that I mean, what do I mean by that? Well, essentially, so at this point, I thought I wrote this out. At this point, this is when you rely on your notes too much, and then you think, oh, I'll remember to say that, and then you don't remember to say that. But here's essentially what I mean. After the road to Damascus, Paul continued to be a first-century Jewish thinker who believed in Torah. But through a powerful experience of the resurrected Christ, he came to preach the teachings of Jesus in the life, death, and resurrection, and that through faith in him, one could be saved. For him, it was just redirected the way in which he was Jewish. Again, because there was no such thing as Christianity at this time. Now, in the hindsight of history, we might call it a religious conversion. But in his day and age, he just got redirected in terms of how he worked out his calling to be moral and religious. Paul?
Pretty radical. It seems to me that there's huge theological conversion. Worldview.
Yes.
Basic worldview of a Christian versus a Jew is fundamentally different. While one may be rooted on the other, it's still fundamentally different. And I think you have to argue that Paul represents the beginning of the way I love your phrase.
Yeah.
Christianity is a CMO.
Yes. Yeah.
Or a GMO.
Yeah.
That's the change.
Yeah.
See, it reorders what's important.
Paul, I agree with you almost completely on all that. I would just say, though, to put it in graphic terms, Paul is the starting point of what today is a large difference between these two religions. But at Paul's starting point, he was near the point of the V. And so at that time, there was much more in common between Jewish and Christian thought than there stereotypically is today. And so I think you're right to say he is the origins of this difference, and something radical does happen on the road to Damascus, but it develops over time. And I think what Paul's letters bear out is his, is kind of Paul's, sociologists call this cognitive dissonance. That is, he was fundamentally Jewish, and yet he fundamentally believed in Christ, and he had to try to make sense of both of these things being true. And in his letters, I think we see Paul wrestling with those two sides of his experience. I think Christians have resolved the dissonance. I think Jewish people today have resolved the dissonance. Paul was stuck in the middle of it, and I think what's brilliant about him is that he actually refused to let those two things, his experience of the risen Christ and his foundational commitment to the Jewish scriptures, he refused to let them come disassociated from one another.
Not to hijack your lesson, but just one last thought. His ability then to attract the Gentiles
Yes.
came from the fact that he had this different theological worldview.
Yes, absolutely.
Than the Jews had.
Absolutely.
And so while they may have contained both of them, to me, this message is that there's this other thing going on that Gentiles can feel attracted.
And that at its core is his vocational conversion. So he gets geared towards the Gentiles in his mission as opposed towards the Jews, right? And so then he has to begin to develop messages, ideas, interpretations of the Old Testament that will then help welcome the Gentiles into the community. We must keep in mind that Paul is not a systematic theologian. When we read Paul's letters, we're not reading 16th century Protestant doctrine, all laid out in nice categories and in neat patterns, however complicated they may be. Paul is writing letters to churches in response to really practical questions, struggles, conflicts. And so in Paul's letters, he's really, he's working out these ideas, right? And he's working it out over time. I think he needs to figure out, how am I effectively bringing the message of Christ to the Gentiles? I think that's essentially his question in all of his letters. And he doesn't start with a full answer in view. He kind of moves his way toward a clearer and clearer sense of how to articulate the gospel in a way that's inclusive of and effective for Gentiles. So let me just take one other question because we're running up on the time, and I'm in liturgy, so it would be bad for me to be late. Yeah, Mary Ellen.
I'm glad you mentioned Facebook, because Facebook told me this morning that today is your birthday.
Yes. Well, I hope Facebook didn't tell you how old I am. 29. I'm 29 now, in fairness, just so you know, I haven't hit 30 yet. Well, we have 2 more questions to ask about Paul's hermeneutic, and I'm inclined to start there next week. Because I need to talk to my publicist who puts together these slides, because every week they put together more than I have time to teach, and we're having communication issues, but I will get with them and we will straighten out what's happening. But thank you all for your participation and your presence this morning. I look forward to seeing you later.